The FIA has faced a year of criticism and has embroiled itself in controversy as its president, Mohammed Ben Sulayem, has introduced rule changes and made statements that have infuriated drivers and fans. Now, however, the sport's governing body has taken things even further. When fans start creating logos that label your organization as fascist, you know things may have gone too far. Today, I'll take a look at the insane rule change the FIA has implemented to try and control the drivers and what it could mean. So don't go anywhere. While Lewis Hamilton's move to Ferrari has been dominating the headlines this week, the FIA has been changing the sport's rules in an attempt to silence outspoken drivers like him. Drivers speaking out against the FIA and its policies has been a major issue for the organization this year, as frustration and anger continue to grow. Frustration over the inconsistency of penalties applied during races, along with the excessive punishments issued for actions outside of racing, has brought the organization into disrepute. The rule change is an update to the stewards' penalty guidelines, which could result in Formula One drivers receiving fines or even championship point penalties for swearing or other violations of the sporting code. These updates extend FIA President Mohammed Ben Sulayem's controversial stance from last season, when he called for F1 drivers to limit their use of profanity. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest F1 news leading up to the 2025 season, be sure to like this video and subscribe. The changes specifically target the section regarding driver misconduct. The FIA defines misconduct as the use of offensive, insulting, coarse, rude, or abusive language, whether written, verbal, gestural, or symbolic, that could reasonably be perceived as inappropriate, offensive, or humiliating. Misconduct also includes physical assault, such as elbowing, kicking, punching, or hitting, as well as incitement to such actions. The punishments for these infractions are now clearly outlined in the sporting regulations. The first offense carries a fine of €40,000 for an F1 driver, increasing to €80,000 for repeated violations. Additionally, a suspended 1-month suspension can be imposed for severe misconduct. A second offense results in a higher fine, while a third infraction carries a penalty of €120,000, along with a 1-month suspension and a deduction of championship points. I think we can all agree that a driver physically assaulting another driver is completely unacceptable, and the penalties outlined by the FIA seem more than fair in such cases. However, applying the same level of punishment for actions like swearing over the team radio, criticizing the car in a press conference, or making an obscene gesture, such as Liam Lawson flipping off Sergio Perez last season, is bound to create friction with the drivers. But it doesn't stop there. Similar penalties will also be issued for any words, actions, or writings that cause moral injury or financial loss to the FIA. This includes any actions or statements that harm the FIA, its affiliated bodies, its members, executive officers, or more broadly, the interests of motorsport and the values the FIA upholds. Additionally, any public incitement to violence or hatred falls under these regulations. To put it simply, from now on, questioning or criticizing the FIA or its president, Mohammed Ben Sulayem, in any way could result in severe penalties. The first offense carries a €40,000 fine. A second violation leads to an €80,000 fine and a suspended 1-month suspension. The third offense results in a €120,000 fine. Additionally, the FIA has retained the same fines for making and displaying political, religious, or personal statements that violate the organization's principle of neutrality, as outlined in its statutes. These statements are only permitted if they have been previously approved in writing by the FIA for international competitions or by the relevant ASN for national competitions within their jurisdiction. Furthermore, drivers who make such statements are required to issue a full public apology and retract their comments. This raises the possibility that the drivers' or constructors' championship could be decided by something as trivial as a driver swearing over the team radio. For instance, someone like Lewis Hamilton could face a 1-month ban for supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, or outspoken drivers such as Max Verstappen, Yuki Tsunoda, or Kevin Magnussen could receive point deductions simply for venting their frustrations over the radio. A clear example of this would be the penalties handed to Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen last season, with Verstappen seemingly used as an example to warn other drivers about the consequences of challenging Mohammed Ben Sulayem. Last season, Verstappen was sentenced to community service in Rwanda for criticizing his car during a press conference. Under the new rules, that same comment would result in a €40,000 fine. Meanwhile, Lear was fined €1,000, half of which was suspended on the condition that he didn't repeat the offense within 12 months, for the exact same infraction. This season, that same violation would now carry a €40,000 fine. The stark difference in punishments between the two drivers did not go unnoticed, with Verstappen receiving a far harsher penalty than Lear. The stewards justified the leniency towards Lear by stating that he was immediately apologetic. Perhaps in the future, drivers could reduce their point deductions for calling the FIA idiots simply by buying Mohammed Ben Sulayem a milkshake as an apology. While the excessive penalties for swearing or making gestures are concerning, the most troubling aspect of these rule changes is the punishment for any words, actions, or writings that cause moral injury or financial loss to the FIA, its affiliated bodies, members, or executive officers. More broadly, these rules aim to protect the interests of motorsport and the values defended by the FIA, while also prohibiting any public incitement to violence or hatred. Last season, the FIA faced heavy criticism from drivers and the Grand Prix Drivers Association over rule changes, the inconsistent enforcement of penalties during races, and punishments for actions off the track. Verstappen, for example, was penalized for saying his car was undrivable in a post-race press conference. In response, he restricted his answers during the FIA's official press conference at the Singapore Grand Prix and instead held a private media session in the paddock. The world champion voiced his frustration, saying, "I find it ridiculous what happened. So why should I give them full answers? Because, as we've seen, it's very easy to get a fine or some kind of penalty, so I prefer not to speak much, save my voice. We can do interviews somewhere else if you need answers." The Dutchman's penalty was seen as unfair by many, with Verstappen adding, "I don't agree with any of it." Mercedes driver Lewis Hamilton also weighed in, calling the penalty a bit of a joke, and suggesting Verstappen should refuse to comply with whatever punishment the FIA imposed. "It's the pinnacle of the sport," the seven-time world champion said. "Mistakes are made. I certainly wouldn't be doing it, and I hope Max doesn't do it." Verstappen himself stated that he had been punished to set a precedent, and that in his case, the FIA wanted to make an even bigger example. "I guess for me it's a bit weird because I didn't swear at anyone. I just said one thing about my car." Of course, all of these statements would now be punishable by the FIA, but it all started when the FIA president declared that he didn't want drivers to swear anymore, saying that he wanted them to behave in a way that differentiated motorsport from rap music. Hamilton took issue with Ben Sulayem's language in that statement, claiming it carried racial undertones. Saying rappers are very stereotypical. If you think about it, most rappers are black, so when he says we're not like them, those are the wrong words. There is a racial element there. If Hamilton were to make that same statement now, it can be assumed that he would face a punishment from the FIA, as would any driver who criticized the statement as inappropriate. There will undoubtedly be pushback from the drivers on this rule change, but how they will go about it remains uncertain. The rule change clearly shows that the FIA is positioning itself to crack down on those who challenge the authoritarian direction that the president is taking the organization. This is the moment for the Grand Prix Drivers Association, GPDA, to step up and make a stand. The organization typically operates behind closed doors and only intervenes when absolutely necessary. But with the collective power of the drivers behind it, and the GPDA being shielded from the individual fines, point deductions, and bans that the FIA has empowered itself to impose, the association has the ability to organize and take collective action against the FIA. The sport cannot run without the drivers. If the FIA seeks to make itself untouchable by punishing drivers who speak out, then the GPDA is the tool the drivers can use to fight back.